And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
And each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is Dr. Heather Petrocelli. She's a leading expert in queer spectatorship of film. She is the person behind Queer for Fear, a massive research project into the LGBTQ+ community and their relationship to horror, and the author of the forthcoming book, Queer for Fear, Horror Film, and the Queer Spectator. Welcome to the show!
Yay! Very excited to be here. Thank you.
Really excited to have you here. I remember seeing when your survey, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but I remember seeing when your survey came out, and I was like, I gotta remember to get you on the podcast. So I'm glad that this is all happening finally. But take us back to the beginning. How did you get introduced to horror?
I'm sure this is I don't know how long you've been doing this podcast. I know that there were maybe hundreds of episodes. Is that possible?
Yeah.
So I'm sure you hear this all the time, but I kind of don't remember not being attracted to the dark and the macabre. Like, I was one of those kids that just was always attracted to something that was more foreboding. And you know, I'm just looking at the two of you. I think I'm considerably older than both of you. So I also grew up in a time.
Me, for sure. I am a child.
I'm 41.
Okay, maybe not considerably.
I'm 29.
I'm going to go with considerably.
Fair.
I mean, people can do math and figure out how old I am once I start talking about the film I brought. But so my love of horror just became something like I can't actually trace when I didn't love horror, but horror means lots of things to different people. And when you're a little person, horror can literally just be, you know, The Wizard of Oz and the Flying Monkeys.
Yep.
We just talked to someone about that the other week about how Wizard of Oz scarred them for life because of the flying monkeys and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's like one of those things that your podcast is based on these things that are scarred for life. It's funny how certain things stick with you. So when you see them, we have relationships to our cultural artifacts, right? So it's like, I'm not scared of the flying monkeys anymore, but there's still this like visceral reaction I have to certain things from when I was a kid that scared the shit out of me. So yeah, that's kind of like how it started. My gateway was probably The Wizard of Oz, and then things like Scooby-Doo just kind of kept them going, and it never stopped to the point where I decided to go to school to study horror.
Hell yes.
Do you remember, Wizard of Oz, it sounds like was your gateway, but do you remember, would you consider that your first horror movie experience?
I guess in retrospect, like assigning that, like looking back at what kind of was the first real thing that attracted me, because I was so little. I mean, I was probably still crapping my pants, like I saw as a little kid because it was on TV all the time.
Yeah.
But as far as like the first horror movie I saw where I knew I was watching a horror movie, it was Night of the Living Dead.
Okay.
Oh,
so I've told this story before, but I'll just quickly say it. I come from generations of New Yorkers. My family's from like the Bronx and Brooklyn.
Okay.
And when I was young, going into grade school, my mom decided that she wanted more for the family, so she wanted to get out of New York. So she decided to move to Arizona. Didn't know anything about Arizona. And Arizona has these monsoon seasons and it floods. So very shortly after we moved there, we got evacuated because of a big flood. And we wound up in a gymnasium. And the whole community, the area of the community was in this gymnasium. And it was just a chaotic scene. And no one was going to be sleeping in their army cots that night, right? So I was just wandering around as a tween trying to figure out what to do and probably a little bit bewildered and dazed and all those things. And there was a room where this guy had a 16 millimeter projector and he was screening. He did Pink Flamingos and Night of the Living Dead.
What a double feature.
Yeah, and my life was never the same.
I mean, I can understand why.
And I was probably, I was looking back, I was too young to probably see either of those. But
how old were you again?
I think I was about 11 or 12.
Okay. That is a formative time to see both of those movies.
John Waters.
Yeah, I wasn't supposed to be there, I don't think. And it was 16 millimeter, and it was like, it also kind of created a love of, when you're my age, it's like I didn't not everything was always celluloid. So it was like, but the fact that like a movie on celluloid could be screened outside of a theater, it blew my mind. Those movies blew my mind. I'm sure I was terrified. I'm sure I was confused. It's long enough ago that like the mythology around that night is bigger than the truth of that night.
Right.
Yeah.
But
Right.
I grew up worshiping John Waters and horror. So it worked.
That's amazing.
Thank you, Arizona's monsoon season, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. I know. I think about that sometimes and how like life is full of all these weird turns. And if my mom hadn't decided, I mean, Arizona didn't work out for long because it was awful for us. So then I wound up being a Californian for a long time. But
what a change going from New York to Arizona, though. Like that's
yeah, it was genuinely a mistake.
Quite a
yeah, it was.
That's quite a shock to the system for probably a variety of reasons. But wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think the good part about it is that it was a very visceral understanding that there are all kinds of people on the planet because I didn't know anything about Native culture when I was in New York. I didn't know anything about Mexican people when I was in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, that's more to me being a dumbass as a kid, but that was also the education system back in the 70s. So to kind of be moved to a place where it was a whole different people, and then people I was used to in New York were no longer there, or at least not as visible. So it was an important lesson, I think. So, and I got John and horror out of it. So
I mean, it was meant to be,
right?
You know,
yeah.
You mentioned not being able to remember if you were scared that night, but were you generally scared of horror movies and horror media when you were younger? Did it get under your skin?
Yeah, it did. I think that that's also true for a lot of people, and it's become something. It becomes something where I wouldn't say I was like always a scaredy cat, but I was kind of a scaredy cat, just not realizing that I was, if that makes sense. And I think it had to do with the fact that as I was coming into understanding my own sexuality and how I was different than the world, I kept forcing myself into scenarios, whether they be real life or filmic, that kind of made me feel really uncomfortable and scared me and gave me nightmares because it meant that I was going to survive the real life horror of everything. So
right.
Oh, okay.
That kind of goes back to like, I always remember Wes Craven saying that like horror movies are kind of a boot camp for the psyche. Like the idea that it helps you like process real world trauma. And that's something that I've always found. And I think it's one of the unsung pleasures of horror films, of a good horror film. Yeah.
I mean, I completely agree. An entire chapter of the forthcoming book is all about, queer insidious trauma and how horror helps queers specifically. This is a very queer project. So it's like horror does this for all kinds of populations, but I am focused on the queer community and about how horror can create a release valve for a specifically queer trauma. I mean, literally the trauma of being queer in a cishet society.
Yeah. So I'm curious because I guess, I mean, the answer could be as easy as you saw Pink Flamingos, but do you remember the first time that you saw like queer representation in cinema? Well, actually, it would be a spoiler for the movie I picked. Okay. All right. Yep. All right. But it was one of the first, it was one of the first. It's the dyke word. It was the first time I heard the word dyke. And when I saw this movie, it was right as I was 100% like really understanding, oh my God, I'm one of those. So, okay. But I think that, we talk about gaydar, at least we used to always talk about gaydar, but I think when you're young and you feel out of step with much of the world, you're drawn to certain things. So like just weird things. Like I've always loved Paul Lynde. I was always attracted to like, not like physically attracted, but I always attracted to the personality of Paul Lynde, or I was obsessed with Endora. So all of a sudden when you grow up and you realize that these people who you were obsessed with, who you had no idea that they were actually gay, were gay. You're like, holy crap. Like, what is this? So I'm trying to think of other early, I'm trying to get like the first real queer. I think the film I picked was the first time I was like, I saw, like, because I was around 12 or 13 when I saw the movie the first time. Well, we'll get to that. Yeah.
So, do you still get scared now when you watch a horror movie, or have you kind of become more desensitized to horror films?
I think, sadly, I'm a little bit desensitized, but the whole premise of horror is that, when horror is effective, horror is affective, right? So I'm not like, my physiological response is like I get startled at jump scares, but I also find most jump scares really cheap and stupid. I'm not like, that's not my kind of horror. I'm always intrigued. Like I know, let's see, I'm trying to think of the last big, on Instagram, all of a sudden you go on Instagram, then everyone's talking about one thing. You're like, well, shit, I need to hurry up and pay attention to this. And I think the last time that happened was The Sadness from,
okay.
And I was so excited to be like totally grossed out or whatever, to feel particular feelings. And I watched it and I was like, I mean,
wow.
Interesting.
Oh, tell me more. Wow. You tell me. Well, I mean, there's some fucked up scenes. Don't get me wrong. I'm not like a monster, guys.
That was nothing.
No, that movie really like affected me on a visceral level. Yeah. Just like particularly the way it ends, where it just, I mean, spoiler alert, you can skip ahead, listeners, if you haven't seen it, but like just the idea that we've been following this guy along, trying to reach his love. And by the end of it, he's no better nor worse than the people he tried to save earlier. Like the idea that deep down inside, he's as evil as the rest of the people out there is like such a heartbreaking thing and like a horrifying thing, on top of like the very visceral. I got queasy at a couple parts of that.
I mean, yes. Okay. Let me backpedal so I just don't sound like a completely desensitized monster. But I did.
No, I've seen people say that about it. Like, it's you watch a lot of new French extremity movies, and this is not Hell doesn't hold a candle to it. So I get it. I don't think that.
Yeah, I think the thing I will say, my partner, when we got together, she was like, I don't really like horror, and I was like, yes, you do. Everyone does. It's just we have different labels, and there's like a zillion subgenres, and there's all different things. Like there's something. Now I think she actually would say she is a horror fan now. She just realizes that some horror is not for her.
It's not for her.
I did know that was not going to be for her. So I watched it by myself, and she just happened to walk in at a moment, and she looked at me. She looked at the television, and then she looked at me, and she's like, is that dude like skull fucking her eyeball? And I'm like, yes, don't judge too harshly. Let me get. And she just like shook her head.
Like. Just kidding.
And she just walked away. And I was just like, I am trash. I watch trash.
That's what happens to me with my fiance. He's like, what you watching? And I'm like, this movie about a kid who dies or whatever. He's like, sounds about right. And then like walks out of the room. He's just like, and I'm like, because he also likes horror movies, but I like extreme horror, and he doesn't understand how I can watch extreme horror. But
yeah, and I think
we all like our stuff.
Yeah, it's like I remember, you asked me kind of films that. Well, you didn't ask that really, but like I'm trying to think of like films that really got to me. It's been a really long time. I think I'm kind of broken and dead inside. So the last film this was many, many years ago now, but I didn't know anything about Martyrs. And someone was like, you need to watch this movie. And I was like, yeah, sure. And I put it in, and it was such an experience. And I don't even know what adjectives to use around the experience of Martyrs. Mm-hmm. That when it ended, I felt kind of tingly and numb and shocked, and I couldn't quite figure out what I had just watched, so I turned around and watched it again.
Whoa!
And I haven't had that in a long time. But there's movies I love. Thought Titane was amazing. Thought X was great. Like there's there's lots of movies I love. I just haven't had that real kind of something that clinches you and you have nightmares all night. I have more nightmares about the real world, which also goes back to the film that we're going to talk about. So
wow.
I'm just curious, like, what are the last films that really got you to?
I mean, for me, like, I always go back to Hereditary. Hereditary, like, really fucked me up.
Let's talk about your family dynamics.
I know. There's a lot to unpack there.
Not for me. You don't want to know.
Pack it down. I went and saw Hereditary. And so this is okay, let me back it up. My main argument, if I had one sentence or two sentences about all of my years of research, thinking and talking about horror film and reading about horror film and writing about horror film, is that horror is a queer genre understood queerly by queer audiences. Okay. So that's the thing. But the underlayment of what I kind of really discovered with doing that survey and writing and reading and researching and talking to people is that our love of this genre it's idiosyncratic, right? So you had Hereditary fuck you up. I went and saw it opening night, sold out crowd, and I kept laughing my way through because that's probably how I process my trauma. And so I was just laughing. And this like straight couple next to me just turned to me finally at one point and was like, why are you fucking laughing? This movie is not funny. And I said, it's hilarious to me. She literally just said something about like that fucking face on your fucking face. Like that is high camp and there's no other way. And I basically was like, buddy, it's funny. And then by the time it ended, they were just like, the ending of Hereditary, for some people it falls apart. It's like, I kind of like it because I like ridiculous shit.
Yeah. I love it.
I love the ending of Hereditary. It's just like, of course, that's the best way to end it. But
right? It just like just take something that was been on 11 and just take it to 12. It's just like amazing. Go all the way. So it's just one of those things that's really interesting to me because I actually responded to Hereditary as high camp, even if it wasn't created that way. But in my survey, I asked people what their scariest film was. And I just asked for one film. So I want everyone to choose the one. So it's kind of like your podcast for all these years. I was really shocked that for the younger generation, it's Hereditary. And for the older generation, it's The Exorcist. Which makes sense.
See, I find The Exorcist very funny.
See? And The Exorcist traumatized me as a child. So
Mary Beth, too.
It did. I rewatched it the other day, and it wasn't as scary. It was wild. I think I've talked about it so many times at this point. I'm just like, this is boring, which is terrible. But like, because my fiance had never seen it, so I was showing him The Exorcist for the first time, which was cool. He was like, what's happening? I'm like, oh my God, what an experience. But the movie for me, like Hereditary was... No, it was Terrified, which is a Argentinian film that one actually made me turn my lights on. But then the one that didn't scare me, but really got me trauma-wise is Hypochondriac, which isn't out yet, but like that made me have a panic attack.
Oh, that sounds like, I mean, is it just about a hypochondriac? Or is it? No,
it's about a queer guy who starts realizing that he has inherited the mental illness from his mother and like what that means. And I am going through something similar as a queer woman, figuring out that she might have inherited the mental illness from her dad. So it's like very similar to the stuff I'm going through right now. And it goes to some crazy places, but it scared me more like existentially than anything else. But
those are the best frights to me, honestly, that like existential dread. I mean, because I was just on another friend's podcast talking about my love of The Return of the Living Dead.
Oh,
it's such a good movie. And
I love that movie.
We were talking about my relationship to comedy and horror because I do really love like horror comedies.
Okay.
And I said, but when I was a kid, it was one of those movies where I saw it in the movie theater. I snuck into it. It was in a mall, very 80s.
Love it.
And I laughed, but it still scared the shit out of me when I was a teenager. And what it tapped into was that existential anxiety that I live in a constant state. Like, that's never gone away. It's just part of who I am, a giant mess of existential anxiety. So those, like, for you to give those reviews, I'm like, well, I gotta like make sure I see Terrified from Argentina, and I gotta make sure
Terrified is really good. I mean, there's a lot of kind of dread, like it builds to jump scares, and there's a lot of like surprising imagery in it. But it's a movie that got under my skin too. I saw it in the movie theater and at a festival, and was like just shell shocked when I left. It has a lot of really. Yeah, please do.
I will.
Yeah, and Hypochondriac comes out in August on VOD, okay. And it's just like it's just very queer too. So I feel like you have to watch it because of your research.
Yes.
And actually, speaking of research,
can
you tell us more about your research, like the survey that survey that you've worked on, and kind of what that research work entails?
Yeah, yes. The answer is yes, I can.
But will you?
I will not. I'm just kind of rambling. Yes. So about the research, the way it all came about is we've kind of talked about it. I was a I have been a lifelong horror fan. I love horror. But when I was a kid, number one, girls weren't supposed to be in horror. It was the domain of young, kind of just like white straight boys.
Yep.
And when I got old enough to be like, I'm going to go be a horror fan legitimately, the first thing I did was I went to a weekend of horror, a Fangoria Weekend of Horrors in the 80s. And it was atrocious. It was one of the most unwelcoming spaces I had ever been in. So I was like, well, this fucking sucks. Like, what the fuck? It was a very, clearly I'm still traumatized, even though Fangoria is amazing now. And I love that now what they get is what I call the, straight white cishet horror bros complaining that it's too political and too, all that. I'm like, yes. And that's like it feels like a complete turnaround in my lifetime.
Yep.
Yeah.
And when I was in my mid to late 20s, whatever math, I met a group of friends in San Francisco, and one of my friends from those times had a screening called Midnight Mass in San Francisco. He had a drag queen persona called Peaches Christ.
I was going to say, you said Midnight Mass in San Francisco. I was like, is that Peaches?
Yeah. So I used to work for Joshua at a movie theater, and at that movie theater, Joshua was always very, we connected because we both had a lifelong love of John Waters and horror, became really good friends. And Joshua is, I feel like, kind of a generation below John, maybe 2 generations below John, but like had that same, I'm going to build a community of crazy queers and do crazy things. And so Midnight Mass was the first time I got to be in sold out audiences with majority queer people watching cult and horror films. And it was like, it was a life affirming moment. It was I had never experienced that. I had never understood that the way I understood horror and the way I connected to it was actually about something beyond just who I am as a human, all of my weird little personal proclivities and, idiosyncratic aspects of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically have been a junkie for wanting to see horror around queer people, but it feels rare. It feels rare to be able to gather in those spaces. So fast forward, 20 years. And in 2016, I was one of those people who was just dumb enough to really think that the Orange Anus, like, that was never going to happen. Like, he was never going to win the presidency. So it was a dark time. My brother had just died. Everything was like traumatic and sad. And I was like, this is awful. And I thought, why not go back to school? Like, why not? Let's add to this. But the thing was, my partner's very supportive. And was like, you should do something with horror. It's like, this is your thing. And so I wanted to be able to see if I could ever quantify through basically quantitative and qualitative data that there is a distinct relationship that queer people have with the horror genre. And so I did it via a survey, and it was an incredibly successful survey. So did you take it?
I'm pretty sure I did when it came out. I'm pretty sure I did. I honestly cannot remember, but I'm fairly certain I did.
Yeah, awesome.
Because you did that when was that? It was
2019. Doesn't it feel like doesn't that basically feel like the Mesozoic era?
Seriously.
It's really
I have like such a bad memory over the last 2 years, particularly ever since I got COVID back in 2020, that like I don't honestly remember anything. Like it's just like things just go out of my brain like that. I'm fairly certain I did.
Wow.
Because I remember it coming around and floating around on the internet.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And it was one of those things, like, to just give like a quick props to everyone who took it. I mean, its success has very little to do with me. It was something that I put out.
I'm sorry. I just remembered. I did take the survey. I was like, I know I did. Okay. Yes, I remembered now.
Awesome. Well, then thank you, both of you. It was one of those things that I put it out there. In academia, it's like, to prove something, you kind of have to always kind of top the person before you who had done something. So I really needed to get 220 responses. And the moment you put a survey out into the world, you're really like,
Yep.
So I had 4,107 responses. It is the largest empirical study in horror studies, period. Not queer shit, just period.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
That's fucking amazing.
Fuck yeah.
And the awesome part of it is like there was all kinds of little surprising things. Like I've been asked before, like, what was the most surprising thing? You want to know the most surprising thing to me? Fucking bisexual women were the #1 respondents. That was super surprising to me.
Mary Beth's like, yep.
Bisexual finger guns. That's me.
And it was like, I don't know if this is like a terrible thing to admit, because I remember being like, oh God, it's going to totally skew the data in a particular way. It didn't.
I was going to ask it. So did you get anything? Because like you, obviously 4,000, that's a lot of aggregate data. Was there anything like really surprising coming out of that?
It's going to sound like almost a non-answer, in the sense the most surprising thing is how united we are in our queerness. I mean, that was the most surprising thing. The most surprising thing is that whatever kind of maybe internalized biphobia I had going on, I don't know. But I remember thinking very distinctly, oh, this is going to make it not like they're not going to feel the same way about horror that I do. And it turns out across all of the demographic information, like, and we did, it was gender, sexual orientation, race, age, education level, relationships. There's overwhelming consensus in almost every single category. And there's very few instances that there's fun little tidbits that you find, because it's such a massive mountain of data that you can, I'm someone who really, really, really knows data. Like I know data enough to like be able to do what I did, but there are real true data nerds that could mine probably for a decade with that stuff. And like little weird things like, I'm trying to get, one that like I wrote about very briefly in a footnote was like, because I'm like, oh, someone needs to go do this. Like trans men have a very strong attachment to werewolf films.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of people talking about that, but like not with the research that you have, not with like the kind of the data points that you have.
Yeah.
That's so fascinating.
And then like, American Indians have the strongest, the data shows that they report to love horror the most and feel and report the most knowledge about horror. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, especially when I write about horror having this trauma. I mean, like, that's a very traumatized group of humans in American history, since we're all on Turtle Island. So those are kind of like little tidbits. But if you ask more questions, I can maybe answer them. I'm just trying to think of other.
So where did you get your PhD, and like where did you do a lot of this research?
When I was doing the research to figure out what school to went to, I was trying to figure out, like, I have my first BA I got in cinema studies a while ago. Then I had to get a second BA at one point in my life, and I did a history degree. And then I got a master's in history years after that. And I was like, do I want to do a film program? Do I want to do a history program? And then I was watching a documentary where this guy came on screen, and I knew he was gay, because you just know sometimes. Mm-hmm. And he was at a Gothic center. And I was like, well, what? So I did start doing research in England. There are Gothic centers, and you can get degrees in Gothic studies. So I wound up applying to it was the Manchester Center for Gothic Studies that's affiliated with the university in Manchester, England. So that's where I did it.
See, and that's why I thought, because when I initially reached out to you, I was like wondering about time zones, because I knew that you went to Manchester, and I was like, so I assumed you were over in the UK. So is it online? Can you do it online? Or did you go there?
I did go there. You don't have to go there, but I did choose to go there before the pandemic. I went each year for a number. The first time was like 6 weeks, and the second time was, I think, almost 8 weeks. Wow. And that was just because this is great. It's great to meet you, and I can kind of see you. Mary Beth, you're a little fuzzy, but I can see, you're humans, and we're connecting, but it's not the same as if we were sharing the same space.
Right.
And so I thought it would be important, plus access to libraries. And I don't know. So, but you can do entire programs online. You need a computer. So yeah,
because that's fascinating. Because like I was an English. I went to school to learn English, and I've always been like huge fan of Gothic literature. So the fact that there was like this Gothic center, I was like immediately in my mind going, that sounds really interesting.
Oh, and then I mean, they're your people. I was a film person, and most of the people there are Gothic lit people.
Okay.
And I will say, as a film person, as a former film student, and then as a grad student in history, I've been to cinema conferences, and I have been to history conferences. Gothicists are the best people.
I love to hear that. Yeah,
I love hearing that.
Well, and I picking your brain about PhD because I got my master's in horror, like in horror film studies, but I read all about horror, and I wanted to go into get my PhD, and then I decided not to for now because academia burned me out while I was doing it. But I'm always like so interested in getting a PhD in something with horror because like I'm obsessed with it, obviously, and it's something in the back of my mind, but I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I have a very how do I be diplomatic? I have a very complicated relationship to academia. I think it's mostly corporate bullshit these days, and I think that school should be free. And this will also be something that kind of comes up when we talk about the movie. Like, I think that to have the space to think long and deeply about something is incredible. And I had these visions. I wanted to be, I don't even smoke a pipe. I don't even smoke, but I wanted to have like my cardigan with my like leather here, my leather little elbow patches with my pipe. And I want to sit around and talk with all these smart people about horror. That's not what happens. You wind up jumping a bunch of fucking bureaucratic hoops. The people, I will do a plug for the Manchester Center for Gothic Studies in the sense that the humans I worked with who work at that institution, they are not the problem. The problem is the administrative side.
Yep.
And I think I've been, everything before going there, all my experiences in higher education were in the US. The neoliberal capitalism is infected everything, and higher education has got problems across the board, at a global scale. But I did find my experiences in England a little less troublesome than some of my last experiences in the US. And that's mainly probably because I think the US just cost so much more. So when people ask advice, I'm always like, don't pay for your degrees, find someone who will fund your degrees. Because, the number of kids I know who have anywhere between $150,000 and $300,000 in student loan debt. Like, oh shit, really?
Not that high, but for my master's, it was high.
It's just
because I went to like University of Chicago, and it was like really cool to have it on your resume. And then I was like, but they don't give a lot of funding.
Yeah, of course.
So,
that's by design.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Can I ask what you wrote about?
Yeah, I wrote about Coralie Farge's Revenge and the importance of women-directed rape revenge films and how she subverts the concept of the male gaze and kind of creates a new kind of gaze in the rape revenge space that is really important in terms of how we process trauma through horror.
Awesome. Well, I mean, just going back to you asked about the data, so there was overwhelming consensus on the positive end and on the negative end in the sense of, when I say consensus, like the majority of the respondents answered one way or another way. And I asked questions about favorite subgenres of horror. Rape revenge had a consensus in being like kind of like the least loved, but I also allowed people to write. But I also allowed people to write in qualitative answers to certain things, and I did a bunch of oral history work. And the thing I learned when I was writing about my trauma thing was exactly what you wrote about, is that for some people, especially if they've had sexual violence and trauma in their life, they do not want to go down that road. But for some people, it's necessary for them to go down that road to, So
I think like that's awesome. I'm a sexual assault survivor, and it's been really helpful. But I also like very much understand that I'm in the minority of that. But I also think that more people are talking about that more now, especially because I think rape revenge movies are turning from complete exploitation and like woman with gun goes crazy, and they're much more nuanced and introspective about that, and more about like PTSD and that kind of stuff. So I think it's just an interesting shift I've seen recently with the number of not men behind the camera when it comes to telling those stories.
Yes.
Really
I mean,
cool.
The number of quotes I had about, I even wrote about this a little bit, where it's just like this, I believe, how do I even say this the right way? Like, this whole arm is the sleeve of Universal Monsters. Like, I love many eras we've had in horror. So I love Hammer. I love all of the 80s crap, because that was the stuff when I was going into theaters, sneaking into theaters. But this era of horror, maybe like what we call it, maybe the last decade, and where you can see we're going as like, I think that we are living in the true golden age of horror. I think it hasn't happened, and I'm really excited. And I just want to read your work, and I wish I had read it before I finished my book.
I can send it to you if you want to read it.
Yeah, I'd love to, especially because I wrote all about trauma. What I did was I took it, and I didn't want to always just stay in the dark, because I think that there's a joyousness to queerness. So I took trauma, and then I basically ended the chapter all about camp, because I have a high love of camp, and I do think trauma and camp are related.
Oh yeah.
Which, back to Hereditary.
Yeah. Okay, so you've mentioned your book a couple times, and I do, before we do move on to talk about the movie, I just want to ask, so I'm guessing the book kind of stemmed from your survey and your dissertation work, right?
Yes.
How's the book writing coming? Is there a release plan?
Well, yeah. So what the book is like, so here's another pitch for if you want to do your PhD, just don't pay a whole lot of money for it. Basically, once the way you can write dissertations these days is that you can essentially write a book. You have to do some kind of hoops and jumps, and jump through these hoops to like pass what you need to pass and get all the approvals. But then you kind of take out some of the signposting, and then you kind of have a book. So the book really is a truncated version of the dissertation. So the dissertation was like 142,000 words. The book is 100,000 words.
Wow. But
killing 42,000 word babies was very painful.
Yeah, I
cannot even imagine.
So I'm at the stage where I just finished all of my word murder, and it's due to the publisher in a week.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's so exciting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It's I think the thing that's hard is that I've been with this now. I've been in this research since 2016.
Yeah. And
I've been with my own words. I finished the dissertation in 2020, and I'm so especially because I had to do all that really intensive edit. I'm so close to it that I can't see it anymore, if that makes sense. So It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting how people respond, especially since a love of horror. Like, we could all list our top 10 favorite horror films, and we might have some crossover, or we could have 30 different films, Yeah. It's a very subjective love. But I still argue that it is anchored in a sameness that feels shared and joyous and campy and trauma-y and all of it. So, and for the release, I kept telling him, I'm like, now's the moment. Get this book out. Especially since I had a little behind-the-scenes drama-rama, because my project was always Queer for Fear, starting right at the very beginning in 2016. I even wrote my proposal that way. And there's a documentary coming out pretty soon called Queer for Fear, which I'm now just hoping will help have people find the book. Maybe.
Yeah. Oh, man.
I mean, yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's what Joshua Peaches, basically, I called Joshua, and I was like, I don't know about this. And Joshua's like, bitch, it's an academic book, and this is a thing that's going to be on Shudder. Like, even if your academic book was like a runaway hit, there will still be tenfold humans who watch, the Shudder doc. So in the end, it will benefit you. And I'm like, only if it's good.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I've been very public. I really hope it's amazing. I want nothing for it to be
Absolutely.
amazing.
Oh yeah.
That's what I will say. And as for the release date, I don't have it, but trust me, I will be shouting it from the rooftop, because I well, 4,107 humans took time out of their lives to very honestly and earnestly answer 66 questions. And some of those questions had 24 parts to them. So I think it was actually like 144 questions. And I'll just say I'm one of those humans that just thinks queers are better. And just going to be real about it. Mm-hmm. And I felt like reading through all of the responses and the intelligence and the vulnerability and the honesty and some of the sass, like it was a very life-affirming moment of, and I'm very, very touched by all 4,107 people who helped create something. Like, I feel like I am the person who had to do kind of like the slightly painful work of coalescing a bunch of stuff, but it's the community that really did the work that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I believe in horror-loving queers.
Hell yeah.
We do too.
We're the best.
We're the best.
I mean, we really are.
It's true. On that note, do we want to talk about the movie you brought with you today, Heather? What movie did you bring? What are we talking about?
I know. It seems a little bit kind of ridiculous after all of this horror talk. You're going to be like, well, what really deep, impactful horror film did you bring? I brought Silkwood.
Silkwood.
I totally brought Silkwood.
Silkwood. Let me read everyone a brief synopsis if they're unfamiliar. Based on the book Who Killed Karen Silkwood by Howard Cohn, a worker at a plutonium processing plant is purposefully contaminated, psychologically tortured, and possibly murdered to prevent her from exposing worker safety violations at the plant.
Wait, is that real? Dude, like, my work is done. I thought I was going to have to convince everybody that this was a horror movie.
Oh, no.
But
no, that's from IMDb. Minus the beginning part about based on the book. I threw that in there. The rest of it, that is straight off of IMDb.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go.
This is a horror movie. Like it's an unconventional choice. We love unconventional choices on here, let me tell you. But no, this is absolutely a horror movie. So take us back to when you first saw this. How old were you? How did you see it? Give us your horror story.
I love this. Oh, unpack your trauma.
Yes.
Okay. So we're just going to get real about this because that's what we do. I was a kid who had some acting out issues when I was a teen. I was a little bit mouthy. I think it was right when I was understanding I was gay and really understanding, like, oh my God, like, what? You know, I mean, this was the early 80s. I didn't know gay people. Whatever. So I got sent away for a while. But where I got sent, they had cable, and I grew up really poor. So cable felt like, oh yeah. And for some reason, I'm assuming when I was a kid, I only have memories of HBO and Skinamax. So I'm assuming it would have been HBO then, but it was like, I didn't go to the movie theaters to see Silkwood. I was like, 12 years old, but I saw it on cable over and over because that's what cable allows. And it fucked with me. It was like the layers of trauma in that film. And I haven't seen Silkwood since I was a little kid, since I was a teenager. But you guys made me rewatch it.
Sure did. And
I cried like a baby, and all of my trauma is all there still because all of the layers of trauma that the film, like, kind of the way the film hooked into me and made me, like, I guess the easiest way of saying it is that Silkwood, when I was 12, destroyed my psychological sense of safety.
Wow.
Okay.
That's an existential one right there.
Ruin you at 12.
It totally destroyed me. And then I guess, I was a weird kid too, because like I was like living in a place where I wasn't with my mom and my brother. I got sent somewhere else, and it wasn't where I lived and everything. And I was like, I decided I was going to reinvent myself as like a bad girl. Which, that like was like, I'm going to start fires.
I'm going to start fires.
That's literally my thought.
Casual arson.
Fires. Totally.
I love that.
And it's one of those, and I remember like writing on my notebook, like, I heart Meryl, I heart Cher. Like, So we can get into it, but like, that's how I first saw it. I first saw it as a kid over and over again when I got sent away to live somewhere for a short while. And then I did not revisit it once in my adult, like I just never revisited it, but it always stood, like I knew the film in my head because I had seen it so many times. And I will say, revisiting it, like, because even when I picked it, I was like, okay, is this going to be something you put on? You're like, dear Lord, how am I going to convince these two humans? And then by the end of the film, I was like, I don't think I have anything to worry about.
You don't, but so you said that there's like a lot of layers of trauma in here. So let's peel back those layers. What give us an example of maybe like the basic level or the like overarching one.
No, well, there's too many. I mean, so it's kind of split.
Okay.
One of it is basically cishet men, the real world, real life, and neoliberal capitalism.
Okay.
So we can like unpack that more, but that was one layer of trauma. And then the other layer of trauma was I was just understanding I was gay, and I had just come out to kids in junior high school being like, I just want you to know I'm gay, which in the early 80s was probably not the best idea. I kind of thought like Boy George somehow was going to make it okay for me. So
I always find that interesting because I mean, I was born in 81, and so I was discovering my sexuality like in the 90s when there was a lot of shit going on that was very homophobic. It was like we're coming out of the AIDS crisis. It was still happening for a lot of it. There was Matthew Shepard. There was the Boys Don't Cry movie that was set in Nebraska, from real Nebraska, where I was growing up in the 90s. There was a lot of trauma, and I didn't come out until I was 30. That's how like deeply ingrained the homophobia was. So hearing that you came out in the early 80s is like, to me, it just because I honestly I thought I was gonna live in the closet for forever.
Yeah, well, I mean, I just to go back to the research, it's because there's a whole lot. I think you have acute and insidious trauma. I think all queers have the insidious trauma, but then based on all of our life experiences, we all also gather acute trauma. And so, it makes my like dark little heart kind of like want to hug little, Gaby you in Nebraska. I don't know why. I look back at my own life and I'm like, what the fuck was I thinking? Like, why did I do that? Why did I verbalize it? Because it didn't make life easy. I still have one of my junior high school yearbooks, and I don't get rid of it just because multiple kids wrote in the yearbook kind of like, I guess you're okay. You kind of make us laugh, but like, why do you keep telling everyone you're gay? And I'm like, 'cause I'm gay. So Silkwood, going back to Silkwood, the other layer of trauma was that, it's even hard to unpack it all because the fact that the character is embodied by Cher, who is now Cher.
Cher.
Cher. I thought that I was destined to live a life of loneliness and rejection because ultimately Cher's character, it's like she pined for someone she was never going to have. She was in love with someone who was never going to be able to love her back the way she wanted to be loved. That whole like, I love you. Well, I love you too. I don't mean it like that.
Yep.
That's how I mean it. I'm like, and the fact that Cher actually toward the end of the movie when Karen Silkwood says, the only thing they kind of call me crazy for is living with you. And she's like, what, because I'm a dyke? And that was the first time I heard someone say it in a way that like, I know at that time that was probably her using the derogatory word about herself. But from that moment on, I was like, I'm a dyke. I'm a dyke. And it's like how I still identify. Like I still prefer dyke to almost anything just because.
Thanks, Cher.
Because Dolly told me. Because Cher. Because Cher. So there's that trauma layer.
I love that because like, there's the word queer, for instance, like I love the word queer,
Me too.
But like a lot of people have a lot of trauma associated with that word. And so they don't want to be called queer. You know, they want to be called gay or lesbian or whatever the case may be, because that word has been used as a, you know, punching bag, you know, and a sledgehammer for most of their lives. But like for me, I'm happy that it's being reclaimed. So I find power in reclaiming those words that might have been used offensively as like, yeah, I am queer. What about it? You know?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I mean, of the like woman loving women category, I prefer dyke, but overall I prefer queer, because queer to me is, well, it's a politic. It's a difference. And it's like, and it's why I was queer for fear. The reason was is that, and I think I wrote this did not make it into the book, but I think it's in the dissertation, which will be like, the dissertation is just a longer version of the book. And one day it'll be free to everybody, because like academic books cost way too much money. So there will be an accessibility at one point in time. I just don't know when that is. But I did say I had to write a bunch to say why I was choosing queer, and why queer was perfectly suited for the horror spectator, for the LGBTQIA plus spectator. And I said, you know, absolutely, there are groups that I am calling queer who it could have been the very last fucking word they heard before they were in a hospital, or didn't even make it to a hospital because things were worse. So it is a very charged word, but like you just said, it's that charge that gives it its power to me. And when Cher says it to, you know, when you're 12, you still have like this brain that's still growing and trying to figure things out, and you're just not sure. And I was like, quote unquote, in a, you know, foreign place, because it wasn't my home. It wasn't my safety, even though I didn't have a really safe childhood. And there was just something the way Cher says it. It actually totally made me tear up, because there's something that was so poignant and sad. Like Cher even has, like, the Dolly character even has that like relationship, but that relationship is like, oh, well, she went back to her husband, and you're like, oh, well, you're just destined for this life to never have a person, because the only way you'll ever be accepted is by some weird fluke of something else. And it's not going to last. It'll be completely impermanent.
Yeah, I had never Sorry. I know. I had never seen this before. I knew nothing about this movie until you brought it up. And so when I watched it, and there was the scene early on that you mentioned where she says like, you know, I love you differently than I love you too. That kind of conversation. I was like, okay, am I seeing something here?
I actually like went back, because I was like, wait, is this gay? Like it took me by surprise. So I was like, oh, there's even more going on here besides, you know, the horrendous abuses of workers at the hands of
like so we can even unpack a little bit even more. So some of the other traumas, and I grew up poor. I was a welfare kid for a really long time until my mom, like a single parent mom, figured her way out to become a nurse, and then life changed a little bit. But by the time she really got her shit together, I was out of the house. The depiction of poor in film is so difficult so many times, because it's like I find there is a layer of trauma to this depiction, in the sense of we are looking at rural poor, and we're looking at a rural poor that is very, very different than the poor I knew. I was very urban poor for a good chunk of my childhood, and urban poor and rural poor are different. And especially because oh God, this is going to get into like a lot of politics. So let me see if I can bypass a lot of that stuff. I will just say that there's so much kindness in the depiction of Dolly, in the sense of like Cher's embodiment of that character. And, you know, I don't know who the real Dolly was, other than I do know she was gay. But think about her being gay. Like I think about like queer elders like that, where I'm like, okay, this is like an entire community that is completely being exploited and, you know, destroyed by this greedy fucking company all over, like a plutonium plant in the 80s, making, you know, well over $1 billion a year. And she's proud enough to be out, but also her story is sad, but she's accepted, and she had her own, a different version of chosen family. Like she was in love with Karen, and she clearly loved Drew. Like she loved her little, her little family. And I think I was thinking back, like, okay, so this was done in the 80s. They were already in their late 20s. So that means that she was already coming out Yeah, and where did she even meet the mortician? Like, where did they meet? Did they?
I know the mortician. I love the slow reveal of that with like, you know, she's a beautician, and then when she's doing her makeup and it makes her look basically like a corpse, it's so pale, and then it comes out that, you know, she's a beautician at a funeral home. I was like, what a funny little writerly thing.
It was like funny, and then a 1-2 punch of like funny, but then saying like the people who work from that plant who come to the morgue were dead before they looked dead before they were even dead. And it's like,
yeah, she has some really good lines. Well, she says so much with so little. How about that?
The way she cuts Drew down that one time, I wrote the line down. I don't remember exactly where was it. I get so tired of your jokes. The way Angela delivers that line to Drew, the way she says it is just, it's so cutting, and it's so like, it's like a read. It's like, you know, it's
totally
so queer, and I love it.
Yeah, I mean, that character is amazing. And it's like, in like little shout out, like little baby, like we'll do a real quick little horror shout out. So I don't know exactly how to pronounce her name, so I apologize for a mispronunciation of her name. But so that's Diana Scarwood, who is the adult Christina in Mommy Dearest. And she was also in, oh God, I'm blanking. Psycho 3, which I kind of love.
Shit.
oh.
And then you have Fred Ward, you know, Tremors. Fred Ward.
yes.
Then you have Craig T. Nelson.
Craig T. Nelson. He's a fucking scumbag
like,
in this movie.
Oh my God. So going back to trauma, so I said cishet white men, real life, and capitalism. Like the cishet white men part. Like also just like these moments where the way he physically tries to trap the women is so upsetting.
It's so gross and casual.
Because and that's just it. Like you realize, oh, this was like nothing. This was like normal behavior.
Well, like Dolly's starting to empty trash cans, and he pushes his chair back, and like I was like, oh, are they friends? Like I don't know. It gives off this like air of intimacy and comfort with somebody that is very, like, as soon as he does it, you realize, like, it's a very much one-sided thing he's doing, and he's being predatory, and it's, like, that sets that tone of, like, nothing here is safe, like, in, like, the literal sense, and the emotional sense, and the mental sense, like, especially for the women, because there's a lot of women in this movie who are working at this plant, like, it's a lot of women and a lot of older men, so it's, like, it's a part of the, like, members of a population that you don't like expect to work in a plant like this. And then you have obviously the guys in the suits that are above everybody else who are like watching, observing, telling you what to do, what you can and can't do, etc. And it's just like one of the things, one nuclear anything freaks me out, like nuclear war, nuclear anything is horrifying, but also this sense of like always being watched, like this paranoia in the movie that I didn't really think about until closer to the end, but how like it's got a Big Brother's watching you vibe, but then you get into the kind of conspiracy, she's being followed kind of situation too, and it's just terrifying. And it made me think about, I have friends who are union reps for teaching unions and things like that. And like, this is still I don't think he's going to get murdered or psychologically tortured in a shower, but I don't know this. But like, it's wild how this stuff is still, like, union busting is still happening, and how people in unions are, because I was like the whole time I was watching it, I was thinking about that, and how like we're still trying to fight for basic rights in the workplace to be treated like human beings and not be completely taken advantage of by our employers. And it's like, I think that so many people on the internet, and it just seems like I don't know if it's a different generation or just political, whatever, like, saying things like, oh, you all are so sensitive and things are so different now. But it's like, no, they're not really, actually. Like, neoliberal capitalism has been a problem for fucking decades, and people are just now more willing to call it out. And obviously this movie tries to call it out, but like, I feel like I had never heard of this movie. And it's Mike Nichols who did The Birdcage. Like, he's not like an unknown director. So it's interesting. But
I mean, like, totally. And Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is like, I think, a queer classic.
Yes.
Which, you know.
The Graduate, Closer, Wolf, like.
A Working Girl, Carnal Knowledge.
Co-written by Nora Ephron.
which I want to give a props out. Here, I'm going to take you on a quick journey I went on with Nora Ephron. So, This is good. I'm gonna sound like such a fucking asshole. Okay. I used to work at a movie theater, and I remember interviewing this guy, and I was like, "What's your favorite movie?" And he was like, "When Harry Met Sally." I'm like, "You're not hired," because he was just like, "It's a perfect movie." I'm like, "Oh no, you are way too straight for me. We are not going to get along." So I'm admitting I was a dick, and it was a long time ago. Recently, someone just made me watch When Harry Met Sally. Here's what I will say. That guy still shouldn't have been hired. We wouldn't have gotten along. But I was paying attention to the dialogue. And what it comes down to is that I'm just old and crabby, and I just don't have a whole lot of time for like cishet nonsense. And When Harry Met Sally just has enough cishet nonsense for me that I'm just like, I can't connect to it. But there was something about that writing that I was like, oh, Nora knew what the fuck she was doing, because they sounded like real conversations. And watching Silkwood, I was like, holy fuck, this, like, films don't feel like this anymore. And I know that like a lot of kids would just be like, it's boring, it's slow, because it's got a lot of nuance, and it's got a lot of layers besides the layers of trauma.
Well, and I was thinking that too, because like these friendships, like the three of them in that house, feel like a family. They have, I think they spend a lot of time with these conversations and these like small intimate moments. Like when Dolly is, I think she's grinding up weed or something, and she gets seeds on the floor. And it's like, it seems so small, but I feel like it establishes the dynamic between everyone. And that's also right before one of the scenes before she tells Karen that she's in love with her. But like the relationships with all these people, and even in the plant, like all of the relationships and like ways everyone knows each other and talks to each other feels very real.
Yeah, and I think it has something to do, like, as I say, like, I think that there's a layer of trauma for me in watching the depiction of like rural poor, and really hooking into a level of like, it is clear it's a movie that shows and doesn't tell. Mm-hmm. We know that there's a lack of access to education. We know that there is racism. Like, there's straight up racism in it. And these are the people that you're kind of rooting for. And it's complicated. And you know that racism actually has to do with the lack of access to education. Also, can we have a moment for everyone fucking smoking 24/7 in that movie?
A giant, like the long, slim cigarette just hanging out of Meryl Streep's mouth. And I was like, wow, what a time. What a time to be alive, where everyone just smoked cigarettes, like in meetings on the plutonium plant. Like,
totally. They're like, I mean, there was that one moment where Drew, we can have like a shout out for like, you know, Kurt Russell here, because there's also the
dude. What a hunk of dude. So
hunky. There's that one moment when, you know, she's complaining about being contaminated, and he's just like, yeah, well, maybe you should stop smoking.
Yeah, that's what really pulled me into this movie is the moments, the little moments you mentioned, Mary Beth, the seeds falling on the floor. It's like, if you were to look at this as an efficient screenplay, it's not, but it's because it's not, and it has these little character moments that I think it kind of makes it feel more grounded and real. And I was thinking about this with Meryl, because, like, I'll be honest, like, yes, she's a fantastic actress. She absolutely is. But I feel like as she's gotten, like, more into her craft, it becomes more of an actorly type of thing as opposed to more grounded. And I'm watching this and I'm like, this feels so natural. This feels like real people. And I don't feel that with a lot of her performances in the last, decade or so. But here, and I think it's also powered to Nora Ephron's script. I mean, this does have a little bit of melodrama in places that almost verge into camp. I'm going to be perfectly honest. The dialogue is it just feels so real. And Meryl just like commands this character so incredibly well. And it brought me back to reminding myself that, you know, she isn't just the Devil Wears Prada or this, like, you know, over the top kind of character, that she can command her craft back in when she's given, I think, a really good script like this.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's so much truth. At some point in time, when someone has been spoken about in a way, it's like there's an extra textual layer that they become the thing that they're spoken about. So it kind of removes them from a thing. Whereas this is like, you know, Meryl, Cher, and Kurt at a very, Kurt Russell has, I will forever just love him many films, but The Thing is the one that's like near and dear in my heart, right?
Absolutely.
And I'm watching something like this and I'm like, oh, it's really too bad he wasn't given more. Like he either got to play action hunk or comedy hunk. So, and he has a layer, like when he goes back and he's looking at the house after the house has been stripped because of the purposeful contamination. And he just walks out and his eyes are all filled with tears and they fucking punches Craig T. Nelson. You're just like, dude, I like have a serious crush on you. Like
it's cathartic. And another scene that I really enjoyed was Dolly's coming out moment where she walks out with Angela and you could tell that this was a surprise to both of them. I don't know how it was not a surprise to Karen because like, and maybe she's completely oblivious because, you know, we're all queer. We can see that queer longing there, but like, they're just like staring and Kurt is like moving his spatula, trying to like create eggs. And they're just like, okay, well, I'm fine with it. Are you? And she's like, yeah, I'm fine with it. Well, why are we talking about it? And he's like, it's not surprising. She's like, yeah, but why are we talking about it? Like, it's just this little funny moment that it feels very of the time where it's like, I think back to like, I think it was a Friends episode where they're like, not that there, or maybe it was Seinfeld. I can't remember. It was one of those two where it's like, not that there's anything wrong with it. Like they keep talking about, was it Seinfeld? Yeah. They keep talking about gay and it's like, not that there's anything wrong with it. And I just felt like that this movie kind of embodied that. I mean, of that era, but like it was, it kind of made me laugh.
Why are we talking about it then was really funny too.
No, it is actually great. Like I'm just gonna like be the like echo chamber. Like, yes, I agree with everything you've said. Like, it's like there are all these great moments, and then back to something that you had said, Mary Beth, about like I grew up in a time when it's like all these generations have these different traumas. So I can't even imagine when it's to be like a little kid in school now when you have to learn how to. I don't even know the words to say with all the shit going on in schools with all of the gun massacres. But I know that kids get trained in whatever that version of safety protocol when there's a gunman. And I'm saying it gendered because that's what it is. And I grew up in the generation of going through nuclear drills in school. And so that fear, like I was my generation, I mean, the generation before me too, because they had they were the first, the boomers.
The boomers,
Fuck the boomers now, but they did have a lot of trauma.
Yeah.
And there's something about like another layer of the trauma was just understanding all of like trying to get your head around when you're basically a tween or a teen of understanding why did they have this plutonium? What were they doing it? Okay, they're making reactors, they're doing it into tablets. What do these reactors do? Okay, these reactors are actually doing electricity. Oh, that's really interesting. So it was like, there's just a layer of all of, I'm trying to think of like some of the films that totally scarred me. It's like, The Day After.
I have like a whole list because like this
Bring
movie, I mean, this movie like just reminded me how much there was like, a lot of times people consider the 80s like a satanic panic, right? But there was a lot of like nuclear panic of the 80s. And there was a whole lot of movies, both here and over in the UK that were basically dissecting it. A lot of them were about, basically us versus Russia. So a lot of them, like there's The Day After, which, aired on ABC and terrified Ronald Reagan to the point that he said it's very effective and left me greatly depressed. I wish he had cared that much about the AIDS crisis.
Ronald Reagan, anyway.
Fuck Ronald Reagan, yes.
There's
and Nancy.
Miracle Mile from '88, Mad Max films, Steel Dawn, War Games, Threads, which is a UK version of The Day After.
Oh, that's really dark too.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Testament. We even had Camille Griffin, who is a filmmaker over in the UK. She created a movie called Silent Night last year. She came with When the Wind Blows, which is a cartoon over in the UK about an elderly parent couple going through a bomb dropping in the UK and the aftermath of that. It's horrific. I remember, and I'm sure you probably do too, I remember the main television networks broadcasting emergency test signals for nuclear war in the 80s. There were fallout shelters were a big thing.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh yeah, this film like hits like when I said that there's layer of traumas and I mean, what the fuck is going on right now? Right now, there's a whole like little generation of kids looking up nuclear war again because of what's going on with the Russian invasion of the Ukraine.
It's funny that you say that because I did find an article from the Washington Post about how the Ukraine it's talking about how Gen Xers who grew up afraid of nuclear war between Russia and the US are having PTSD and deja vu. And there's a line in there from Matthew Chance, who is a CNN international correspondent, and he said he remembers as a kid crying himself to sleep thinking that he wasn't going to make it to adulthood.
Yeah. It was, I mean, okay, I'm going to say some more things. Everyone's just going to hate me. Please don't hate me. I'm actually quite likable. I have a hard time with certain things like maybe Stranger Things or the Fear Street trilogy when they're looking back. And I think maybe you, Terry, could speak more to Fear Street because I think our age difference, I think the 90s were you were like, I'm talking about the 80s and you were that age in the 90s. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so I'm curious. I will just speak to Stranger Things because it's literally hitting at like my age at that time, you know, and I have this really weird issue with it. And I just sound like a crabby boomer, and I don't want to be a fucking crabby Gen Xer, although I am a Gen X grump. So it's like, whatever.
Well, I know what you're going to, I think I know what you're going to say.
But it's this nostalgic look back at a time that makes it kind of neon hued and clean. Mm-hmm. And when you, like, my memories of the 80s are more like the mystery meat sandwich that is in the movie Silkwood. It's like, it was brown, it was kind of dark, it was gray, it was more muted, even though there was lots of color. I mean, there was all the neon stuff and there was all the leg warmers, but it didn't have that sanitized feeling that we now look back at. And I think that there's something just interesting to keep analyzing about the need and the purpose for nostalgia. Because literally we wouldn't have, nostalgia is something that's actually almost created. It didn't exist until we had a way of thinking and organizing time differently, probably mainly because of the Industrial Revolution. So I just, listening to you read the thing about people having PTSD for a time when, like, I remember, I mean, the day after we had to watch it in class, we had to watch it in school. And I was just like, number one, that would never happen today because kids can't be forced to almost do anything, which is making educating them really, really hard because parents have all these, you know, opinions, rightly and wrongly. So I'm just curious if you feel the same thing when you look at something like the beginning of the first Fear Street trilogy, the first one that's like very 90s. Do you feel that same thing? Where you're like, that's not my memory of the 90s.
It's absolutely not my memory. And I remember I reviewed that movie for my site, and I love that movie. I really do. But I was thinking as I was taking notes, I was like, well, this is not the reaction that would happen if someone came out. Like, everyone is too chill about this because, like, we're not. That's set in like what was 96, right? And that's set like at the time of Matthew Shepard's death and all that kind of stuff. Like, this is not a good time to be openly queer when you're a kid. Yeah, so I do think that there is a lot of nostalgia for that era. It really like rang to me because I loved all the music choices and like the music drops and everything. It was like, oh, I remember that as a kid. So like it kind of triggered that nostalgia vibe, and I went with it as sort of like the way I kind of approached it was like, this is something I would have loved to have seen when I was that age in the 90s. Like, that might have actually helped me understand my sexuality and be a little bit more comfortable, because I never had that in the 90s. I didn't have anything. It was like, you know, I grew up in the 80s. I lived in Alaska, and then I lived in Nebraska. So I lived from like isolated to like deeply conservative area. And it was like, I never saw myself in movies or in literature. The only time I ever saw myself in literature was reading some Stephen King books where the queerness was always centered around either violence, or they were a bad guy, or it was like there was queer things happening to people, like sodomy and anal sex, but it was bad. It was presented as evil. And so there's like a lot of that kind of trauma. So for me, seeing this movie set in the 90s, I was like, okay, yes, this is rose-colored glasses, but like, this is what I would have wanted to see.
Absolutely. I will take that and I will extend it and say we could never have seen that because of, like, right? We just wanted to see ourselves. Mm-hmm. We just wanted to see ourselves, right? And it's I think a lot about it because I do go in for a lot of, like, you know, I mean, I just feel like the 80s are everywhere right now. And it's really, it's like kind of interesting. And I kind of see it now slowly, like where the 90s are picking up and they'll supplant the 80s as like, I guess it's maybe they have to pay attention to the marketing dollar of as the generations get older. They're like, well, now the Gen Xers are too old to like fall in for giving us all their dollar bills for nostalgia. But there is something also to that sanitize, hitting it beat by beat for like all these things that trigger. Like I will hear songs that I fucking hated when I was a kid in the 80s. And I'll be like, yeah. And I'm like, what the hell is that? And it makes me want to go back to school and study it.
I think it's interesting the way, because like I'll be honest, the moment Fear Street opened up with 9 Inch Nails Closer, I was like, okay, I'm sold. Yeah, this movie is an A+ for me. Like it was just that like jolt of memory of growing, because I mean I still love 9 Inch Nails, but like back then, just like hearing that song on the radio and being like, yeah, I want to fuck you like an animal, like that's, you know, it's like yeah. So it was like immediately I was like, okay, I'm tuned in. This could be a shit movie, but I am 100% on board.
It's interesting. It makes me want to talk more about this nostalgia in horror in it and how it's used to hook you in, because it's like I have watched every single Stranger Things. I will bitch about things. I will totally complain about things, but I keep watching it because I'm just at this point, I'm just hooked in. But I'm also trying to think like to like not take it too far away and like start talking about nostalgia. I'm trying to think of other trauma stuff from Silkwood.
The one thing that like really jumped out at me when watching it was the shower sequences.
Ugh. Those are true just horror scenes. Like, straight up. Like there's 4 of them basically. Because Thelma's is the first one.
Thelma's the very first one.
And then there's 3. Yeah.
That one it's so. I was thinking about this particularly just a little bit ago because Mary Beth, you're talking about the women in the work center, and I was thinking all of the trauma in this movie is inflicted on the women, because you have Thelma, who is dehumanized. You know, she has her wig on, and when she's getting showered, her wig is like literally tossed to the side as she is being scrubbed and washed down. There's Gilda, who has, you know, trauma. And then there's, our 2 main characters, Dolly and Karen, that are, all of this is inflicted on them. And you don't see the men dealing with any of this. They're the ones doing the washing.
Well, and like the thing too is the women are the only ones getting washed, getting these horrible chemical showers where their skin is basically scrubbed off. And with Karen, it escalates as things get, as she gets more involved in the union, and you're basically trying like water torture, like not waterboarding, but like shoving like that in her face and scrubbing her down and purposely contaminating her so she has to go through that. And it's like
in her eyes.
Yes. And the men in this are like, well, think about the company. And like all of their talk is always just about like, well, think about the bigger implications and don't think about yourself, but like the company. And like, yeah, obviously there's the fear of people losing their jobs if things like this are exposed, which I think this does get into with her friends that are like, please don't talk to me. Like, I'm just trying to live my life. I like my job. And again, it's that horrible thing of capitalism. Like, you have a job, you want to stay in it, you want to keep it.
It's so insidious.
Well, like, you're in a rural area, too, so, you know, there probably isn't as many job opportunities that are nearby.
Yeah, it's a company town. Yeah.
And that's what Angela says, is that, you know, it's like, you see McKee, and what is it? It's
it's Kerr
McGee.
Yeah, Kerr McGee.
You see their names everywhere. It's on the streets. There's just, you know, streets that are named after them. Like, this is your life and this is your livelihood. And so I think that's what's so insidious about this, is it's like, yeah, they're killing us, but we have a job.
Yeah, and how terrifying is that? And like,
isn't at one point, is it Drew or is it Craig T. Nelson's character that's like, I don't remember who it was, like, who cares about cancer? Like, we still have a job. Someone said that at one point about how, like, it doesn't matter. Like, cancer doesn't matter.
So there's like, okay, let's just like go down to like the horror scene. So like, first of all, you're right. Because I mean, we like, I don't know if it's still used, but there was a time where we would talk about the Silkwood shower, right? Like that is it's almost like a horror trope. It is a form of body torture. And all those scenes are really horrific to watch. There is another scene that's just interesting to me is like when they're like in the dark of night, there's those nefarious things going on with blowtorches, and she asks about it.
Oh, yeah.
And you're just like, and they actually cue in kind of like scary horror music in that scene. And I was like, oh, this is very interesting. And then we find out later, like kind of very tropey, that they chopped and buried a hot vehicle
truck.
Which then you think about that and you think about radioactive contamination. You're like, where the fuck are all these vehicles that were like all buried around in Oklahoma? Like, dear Lord. So those are kind of like the overt ones, I feel like. Those are like kind of like very kind of lean into kind of horror tropes in a way. But then there's a scene that actually kind of almost terrifies me, is when they're at that union meeting and the doctor's explaining basically the dangers of plutonium, and Thelma stands up and is kind of like, you know, the guy, he basically responds, we can take out your lung. Would that be a little extreme? And then she sits down, and then the woman behind her, the one they had the party for, raises her hand, but the husband goes to swat her hand down. And then I'm just like, that scene, again, showing and not telling, it says everything. And it does. Horrifying in so many ways. And like the number of times that they repeat. So we know it's a company town. We know this is an incredibly economically depressed area. We know that these people are being, I don't even know the word, they're being exploited to the hilt, and nobody cares. And they're all working double shifts. And you know that they're still living in basically the working poor.
I mean, it's like that. I think that's what's so great about the opening of this movie is that you have that kind of rural house that is often, you know, away from town, where three grown adults who, you know, two of them are dating, but like they're forced to live there because they can't afford anything. And yet you find out that they're working themselves to the bone, where there's the early scene where Karen is trying to find someone to cover for the weekend because she wants to go to her kids in Texas. And there's like that kind of desperation there where it's like, you're working so hard and you have bought into this idea of capitalism that you don't seem to want to know what it is doing to you, that ignorance is bliss. And I think that's where that's what you're saying in particular about that scene, is that he kind of hits her hand down and it's like, he doesn't want to know any of this. He wants to live in that kind of ignorance that maybe bad things are happening, but head down, nose to the grind. We got to keep working.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I feel like, again, this is a film was it 83? We're now in 2022. And let's think about how I would say right before the pandemic started, I'm not going to say unions were dead because there were unions, but they're very kind of select areas where there were unions are still strong. Guess what's having a comeback right now, as a whole bunch of people got shat on during a pandemic. And it was, again, this was like, we tend to talk about things in a lot of race-based ways because we live in a country that's founded on racism. But racism at its core is actually a class issue. I mean, we construct all of this stuff, right? So it's like the way that the themes of living in a like plutocracy of Silkwood all those years ago are almost more relevant in our Amazonian life today, where they're trying to union bust. They have had so many exposés on the unsafe and harmful work practices that a racialized workforce is, you know, that's who's enduring the worst of Amazon's employment as an employer. That shit's really scary. And it's scary that, like, you know, another layer of thing that kind of traumatized me as a kid, when I said it kind of destroyed my psychological sense of safety, is like, where do you feel safe in this movie? Like, it's like hard to actually find a moment of safety, because even when Karen gets folded into the arm of the union guys, I feel that they were incredibly exploitative and didn't give a fuck about Karen.
No.
Right?
She was a pawn for them, too. It's like, she was just like, oh yeah, she's like the poor girl who can do stuff for us and we don't really care about her. Like, she'll get us the film and like, we just need her to name names and get us information. We don't care what that means for your safety. Like, just get it to us.
And whenever she would bring up like safety issues, they wanted to keep focusing on the fraudulent x-rays, the ones that they're being doctored. Like, well, let's focus on that. Let's focus on that. And she's like bringing up all these issues of like everything from, there's 2 showers for 75 people on a shift. Like, she brings up all the stuff and they're like, let's not focus on that. Let's talk about this x-ray, or let's talk about, you know, these horrible effects on people.
The only reason that they listen to her is because she runs out and says, hey, I saw they doctored x-rays. Like, that's the only way they're taking her seriously, when she's like, hey, no, this is a really big problem. And the only reason that they care about it is they say, oh, it'll kill all of these people in the state. And obviously, yes, that is a problem. But it's like, this fucks me up so much all the time, is about like how government/big organizations are willing to sacrifice people for what they deem the greater good. But it really, and they're like, well, we're saving people. It's like, what the fuck kind of rationale is that? Like, these people are human beings that are dying because of your need for money, your need, like, for power. And it just always makes me so sick. And it's so blatant in this movie. It's just horrifying.
Yeah. And it doesn't feel like it's actually a 40-year-old film.
No.
Like, I mean, it's like those things. And I think that's what's scariest. I think when you get older, it's also like, you know, you look back at things and you're like, okay, well, we definitely are making progress because let's talk just about queerness, right? We are making progress because when I talk to like kids, queer kids, they can't quite compute that you couldn't see yourself in media. And I'm like,
yeah.
There was no one. We had nothing. Yep. So we are making progress because, you know, we got gay cowboys everywhere now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to sound like one of those persons that is like, but that is something that's a little bit different. And it feels like you're allowed to have these things because the real machine of everything running everything, all this plutocratic like life, it is worse. Like, you know, our wealth inequality is literally off the charts. I mean, I don't even know how many billionaires we have right now, but, you know, billionaires should not exist. There's no need for billionaires. And when that movie ended, I just remember, I just kind of sat there a little bit stunned. And I was like, oh my God, this, like, I might be completely re-traumatized. Like, all those scars had been kind of buried for like 30 something years. And now I'm like paying attention to what's going on in Russia, what's going on with all these corporations that have basically taken over kind of running the country, you know, and how you don't feel safe anywhere.
Right.
But yeah, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that the corporations running the country, it's sad that it takes a corporation that leans liberal in terms of like social issues to get something changed. You know, it's like we have to rely on corporations to maybe threaten pulling out funds or like leaving Georgia or, you know, that kind of stuff for there to be even a modicum of change. And that's it's insidious in its own way. Like it's nice to see in some ways because like I don't feel like as someone that grew up in that time, you know, grew up before now, where like you didn't see that before. And now you do see it. And so it makes you feel like, okay, there are people here high up making a lot of money that can see you. But at the same time, it's insidious because it's leans into the capitalism machine. Yeah.
And it's like, let's be real. Even these ones that are doing quote unquote, I'm using my, you know, scare quotes, air quotes of right. I'm glad that they exist. I'm glad that they're all not all this like McKee Kerr shit or Kerr McGee shit, you know, but they're all still at the bottom, at the base of everything. It's still always going to be profits over people. And that's a hard thing to really kind of digest. And it feels more and more because the gap is growing as I get older instead of closing as I get older. It just feels harrowing. And then on top of that, if you want, like props to all the whistleblowers out there in the world who have ever done anything to try to expose things. I got in a fight with a friend who was like, kind of, how dare that person leak the Supreme Court dockety memo-y thing about Roe v. Wade. And I was like, oh no, fuck yeah. Like that's a person who like, dear Lord, thank God for them. They're like, oh, they're just like kind of like threw the whole structure. This is a lawyer friend. They kind of threw the whole structure of the Supreme Court into question. And they're going to like, and I was like, exactly. I'm like,
we need that so bad.
I am done. And I think about like Chelsea Manning. I just think about people who we are watching a movie about a real person. We don't know the real person, right? But I think what the movie tries to tell you is that she was no angel, right? She had a lot of crap.
She was messy. She
was a messy person, but she tried to do the right thing and she was trying to be the whistleblower. And every layer of human turned on her. She was ostracized by her peers. She got contaminated by her bosses. She lost her love. Even Dolly, who was in love with her, turned on her. And it's just like the strength it takes. And then to have it all be for kind of not in her. I mean, she died at 28. I mean, she was killed. Like, I don't know. So I'm just kind of depressed. And thanks, guys.
Well, so one last thing I did want to bring up is Dolly. I wanted to talk a bit more about the real life person because her name was not Dolly. It was Dusty.
Oh.
They paid for her likeness. They gave her money for it. And then they changed her name. I don't know why, but her name was Dusty. And after Karen's death, she kind of lived a tumultuous life. So she climbed the exterior wall of the Kerr-McGee plant at one point with a shotgun and was charged with unlawful entry. She was reported in 1980 for being as missing, and people thought she was murdered because she was supposedly writing a tell-all book. It turns out she was in New York City trying to sell with a publisher the tell-all book that never materialized. In 82, she walked into a nursing home in Santa Fe with a shotgun and took 170 people hostage and said she was protesting against the nursing home after learning a resident was being treated poorly and being denied food.
Holy shit. Well, you just added layers to my trauma because that really kind of breaks my heart. And it's like one of those stories that I want queers, like I like my queers a little dangerous, but I think that danger is coming out of a place of severe trauma.
Yeah, because like one of the last big things was that in 95 she was charged with domestic abuse by her girlfriend.
Oh shit.
So there's but I think you see all of this, and I think I honestly you can see. I think you can draw lines to this trauma that she, suffered that sent her on this idea of trying to carry on maybe Karen's legacy in some way. Because, I mean, it's pretty extreme to walk into a nursing home and take 170 people hostage. But in her mind, she's probably doing it to, like, again, prove a point and save people. So there's like, messy person.
Yeah.
But I think. I don't know. I honestly, I do kind of think that Cher kind of enveloped that in her character a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, props to all three of them. I mean, I think they all did a great job of making all three. I mean, I loved Drew. He had a Confederate flag. Like, it's, and I'm like, I love you. I'm like, oh no, I'd hate you and you would definitely hate me, but maybe not because you think Dolly's okay. There's nothing wrong with it.
Right. Why are we talking about it?
Yeah, exactly. So,
like very much an 80s thing of like Confederate flag doesn't mean that anymore. And it's like, but it does.
Oh, no, it's definitely, I mean, because I was trying really hard to think about what I thought the Confederate flag meant as a kid and what I was kind of taught. Because like, I mean, I got like a shit education. Number one, I was poor. So I was in poor schools, which means you have a shit education. And then it was like, Confederate flag was just the South. They were pro-slavery, right? So even then it was like, but I think it's a really beautiful way of saying like, I think it's really important to show that extraordinary things come from ordinary people and people are messy. Like, Martin Luther King was a messy guy. He had a lot of things that he did not do right, but he did an incredible amount like right and change things. And I think that, I don't know. I do appreciate the messiness. I do feel a little sad to hear. It just sounds like is Dusty still alive?
No, I think she passed away in 2012. She passed away in 2012.
I mean, I appreciate I did not do any, there was like a documentary I watched somewhere in the 80s or maybe the 90s about Karen Silkwood, just to like, kind of like, could they definitively prove she was murdered? The documentary did kind of say she was murdered. All the evidence on the car shows that she was slammed from behind and that kind of stuff. But I didn't know. I didn't know what had happened with anyone else.
Yeah, I was looking on Wikipedia and just I find myself falling down rabbit holes all the time whenever I'm doing like research for it. But yeah, no, she passed away in 2012 from cancer.
Well, not surprising. It's like, I just have a quick question. Like, did you like the film, each of you?
Well, that's a good place for us to get into our wrap up.
Oh,
before we do that, I think I know the answer. Do you still find this film as deeply traumatizing as when you were a kid?
Yes, I feel completely re-traumatized. I feel like, oh my God, what kind of whistleblowing do I have to do? How do I like affect change? But I also don't want to be murdered by a company while I'm trying to like make everything better. I don't know. I feel scared and paralyzed. I'm okay with my queerness though.
Hell yeah, that's the important thing.
I feel okay in that.
So, all right, let's get to our ratings out of 5 for this movie.
Right.
Terry, how many Meryl Streep's mullets out of 5 do you give? This very serious movie, I swear, but I couldn't stop thinking about her mullet while I was watching this movie.
It was a powerful mullet.
There was power in that mullet, man. Like, shit.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I wasn't sure what to think of it initially. It is as people probably say, it is a little slower than I was expecting. It's a longer movie, and it was a little slow, but I found myself incredibly enraptured, like we talked about earlier, with the small moments that sort of ended up helping build these characters. I think some of the melodrama, particularly between Karen and Drew, was a little campy at times. The moment where he's leaving and he drives off and then slams his car, stopped, gets out, and he says, "You know, I loved it, baby." I'm like, okay, really? Really? What are we doing here?
But it's such a Kurt Russell moment.
Oh, it so is. But I was like, okay, in a movie that has a lot of really great character moments, that was not it, sis. I was like, okay, what are we doing here? So I think there are moments of that like really kind of unfortunately brought me out of the movie. But I was just so taken by Meryl Streep's acting and the dialogue, as we said, that I'm probably gonna give it. I'm going to give it 4. I'm going to give it 4 Meryl Streep mullets out of 5 for myself. What about you, Mary
So
Beth?
I initially wanted to give it 3.5, but this conversation has actually made me bump it up to a 4, because I think there really is so much really interesting stuff going on with this movie, especially for that time. I think, one, it's Mike Nichols, and I love the birdcage, which is very much the opposite of the fucking birdcage, but still. But
range.
I know, but it's just, what I never knew about this person. I never knew about this woman and what she tried to do for workers' rights. And I always appreciate being able to see how much women and with Dolly, a queer woman, are involved in history in a way that you don't see a lot, or people try to hide it or bury it or just make it seemed like there aren't a lot of women and queer people trying to make the world a fucking better place because cis white men ruined it. But yeah, this movie I think got in my head about it, and again, it feels so relevant today with the way people are treated in unions, but also the way that workers are treated at Amazon. My brother works at Amazon and tells me the horrible shit that they make people, how they treat people at Amazon, and this isn't a new story, and it's not an old story. It's just a story that's been a reality for a really long time. And yeah, it's 4 Meryl Streep mullets out of 5. Heather, you have the final word. How many mullets?
Because a year after Karen Silkwood was killed, the plant closed. I'm going to go one step up, and I'm going to give it 4.5 Meryl Streep mullets, because she lost her life, but she fought an incredible battle. She did bring a light to all of the atrocities happening at that plant. But like you said, there are still just Kerr McGee's everywhere right now. And I also have a friend that worked at Amazon and wasn't allowed to tell me a lot of things because they signed things that say you can't tell you about. But I heard a number of things that I actually thought that he was making it up. That was that atrocious in the name of productivity and profit at the expense of a human. So I'm gonna give it maybe I'll give it 4 mullets and a boob, because she does that great boob flash.
Yes! Oh my god,
she sure does.
I was like, this is my bitch right here. She just will flash her tit in the middle of the workplace when a guy's giving. I'm like, yes. Oh, I was
right.
obsessed.
And then, there's so many moments. I know I'll shut the fuck up, but again, about the power of showing and not telling. Her working through the lunchroom and just eating everyone's food. I'm like, you know who she is, and if she was your friend, you'd be like, bitch, fucking get it together. But you'd still love her and totally respect all that chutzpah.
Yep.
A lot of moxie. So 4 and a boob.
4 and a boob. I love it. But one final point that I just remembered that made me laugh so hard is the scene after Dolly is with Angela and Angela is ready to move in. I'm like, okay, this is the U-Haul lesbian trope, to the max right there. That the second date, you got yourself a U-Haul and you're moving together. I was like,
and they're just sitting in the car with the groceries, oh,
I guess she's moving in now.
Our new roommate.
I mean, Angela is really a very shining star in that movie. Yeah,
she really was. I really liked her. But anyway, thank you so much, Heather, for joining us to talk about Silkwood and introducing this movie to us. Where can our listeners find you, and what do you have coming up that you can share?
You can find me at Queer for Fear on Instagram, and if you feel the need to email me, you can email me at queerforfear@gmail.com. And I guess my next big birth into the world will be when the book is released. So maybe we can come back and talk about trauma. Just trauma. I mean, it's what you do, but we can talk about just horror and trauma. And I will have read yours, so then we can put our works in dialogue with one another.
Sweet. I love that. So listeners, you've heard from us, but we want to hear from you. What was your experience with the movie Silkwood? Send us an email at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com. Or reach out to us directly on Twitter. I'm at MB McAndrews.
And I'm at Gaily Dreadful.
And of course, don't forget to follow the podcast on Twitter at Scarred Podcast.
And please don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe. It really helps us out.
It does. Thank you to Eric Parr for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please stay safe out there, but most importantly, stay creepy.
And until next time.